Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. This is the Stephan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Today, my guest is Matt Ahlborg. He's a data scientist and he's doing some fascinating work. But firstly, let me introduce the sponsors of the show. So this show is brought to you by Kraken, one of the world's leading Bitcoin exchanges. So if you're looking to buy or sell or trade Bitcoins, you've got to check out kraken.com. They've got one of the most liquid exchanges. They're one of the longest standing exchanges. They're renowned for their focus on security with Kraken Security Labs. They've got Kraken Pro mobile app where you can buy and sell. And basically, it's been designed with a beautiful interface. So check out that app. It's available both for iPhone and for Android. So go to kraken.com to get that. Next up is CipherSafe. So CipherSafe create the product, the Cipher Wheel. So if you've got a Bitcoin hardware wallet or you've just got a seed that you want to protect, those 12 or 24 words, you need to look into having one of these products. The reason being, you essentially want to make sure your product is fireproof, waterproof, pet-proof, and tamper-evident. And so the Cipher Wheel comes in a wheel shape and it protects the words of your seed. It's got two sides to it, and you can get a padlock matching with it that helps you know if it's been tampered with and so on, or know if it's been opened. So that's something that you can purchase as well. The website for that is ciphersafe.io. They've also got a few little add-on bits and pieces as well. So if you want, you can buy some casino dice. So that'll help you when you're rolling for entropy, to add entropy to your seed as well. So make sure you check them out. Next up is Swan Bitcoin. Now, disclosure, I hold some equity in Swan Bitcoin. I have been helping the team out. I advise on some of the different educational material that Swan Bitcoin are producing. And if you're looking to buy Bitcoin in the US and you want to do it automated, to buy every week or every month with Swan, this is the place to do it. I think there's a big psychological benefit to you as well, where you don't need to manually buy Bitcoin. You can just connect your US bank account via ACH. Swan Bitcoin will pull the Bitcoin, pull the fiat, buy Bitcoin, and then send it out into your wallet if you so choose, which is obviously the recommended option. Not your keys, not your coins, right? So the website for that is swanbitcoin.com. Now, lastly, Unchained Capital, Bitcoin financial services. So firstly, just go to unchained-capital.com. Check out their blog. They've got incredible material. There's a good recent post by Dhruv Bansal talking about the difficulty adjustment. So they've got some incredible material there on their website. And then if you're looking for ways to secure your Bitcoin, look at their Vault program. They've got a 2 of 3 multi-signature Vault program. So you can buy, say, one Trezor and one Ledger and set it up on the website. And it's all really easily done. Whereas if you're trying to do DIY multisig, that can be really technical and very difficult. You might make a mistake. Where Unchained Capital, they've got a team of professionals helping you do that. Also, Unchained Capital offer loans. So you can put up some Bitcoin and get USD liquidity. And then basically, without having to sell your Bitcoin, you can get some liquidity. So that's also an incredible benefit. So make sure you check them out. The website for that is unchained-capital.com. All right, so let me just bring in my guest now. Matt is a data scientist. He is doing some incredible work. I had to have a chat with him and talk a little bit about what he's doing. So welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Awesome, man. So look, Matt, I've had a chance to look through some of your work. I've also listened to your interview with Tales from the Crypt with Marty. So that was also a great interview. So perhaps if you could just start with telling us a little bit about yourself, the work you're doing as a data scientist.
Sure. Yeah. So I, as you said, I'm a data scientist. I have somewhat of a background in computer science. I got about halfway through a computer science degree. I felt it wasn't going fast enough for me. So I dropped out of the program and I decided to attend a data science 3-month boot camp in New York City. It worked out really well for me. When I went into that boot camp, I actually brought in the local Bitcoins data set and the Paxful data set. Those were my basic experimental data sets that I was using from project to project in the boot camp. And I became a data scientist because I was so interested in how Bitcoin was being used, and I wanted to learn how to jump into these data sets that I knew that were out there. and start to analyze them in a way that would begin to tell stories about how they were actually being used. So, yeah.
Great. And so how did you first come across some of these stories?
Yeah, so basically, I've been watching local Bitcoins and Paxful for several years now. They are very interesting exchanges to me because the vast majority of their users come from countries which, generally speaking, do not have a lot of they tend to come from a certain class of countries which have particular socioeconomic problems and political problems and things of that nature. They generally don't have standard banking connections to crypto exchanges in these countries. So in the United States, for example, Coinbase is allowed to directly connect to your bank account. But in these other countries, they don't necessarily allow those connections all the time. So yes, I was very interested in these data sets that I've been following them for some time. To me, they represent the ultimate test, or the best test of the value proposition of Bitcoin. And a lot of people marketing for Bitcoin try to say that it's going to bank the unbanked and it's going to help the little guy. And when you look at the data on these exchanges, that it will actually tell you if that is actually taking place or not. So yeah, in addition to the data on the exchanges, I also talk to the traders themselves. So if you go to these websites, you can see the advertisements to trade in different currencies and countries around the world. And inside of these advertisements, the publisher of the advertisement oftentimes puts their phone number in the ad. And so I began kind of texting and opening up communications with these various traders and asking them what people were buying and selling Bitcoin for in those countries. And when I started doing that, I started getting some really amazing, gold mines of information from people where just the Western world, or crypto Twitter, or whatever you want to call it, they just really had no idea that this stuff was even happening. And so, yeah.
Can you give us some indication on the size of this in the developing world? Do you have any kind of rough figures that you could give?
Sure. So I think, so in terms of volume, like I said, I mostly watch local Bitcoins and Paxful. And in 2019, I believe local Bitcoins did approximately $3 billion worth of Bitcoin trading. And I think Paxful was at about a little over 1 billion. I think Paxful now has about 3.5 million users. And local Bitcoins, I'm not sure the exact number, but I believe it's a little bit more than Paxful, maybe significantly more than Paxful, but it's in I would think less than 10 million. So.
Awesome. And so I think these stories are really interesting because it sounds to me like in the Western world, in the developed world, it's sort of, so the message might be seen more like, oh, it's all about hodling and people are speculating on future adoption, and they're not necessarily using it for day-to-day commerce or any sort of some of these kind of voucher get-arounds, whereas that is a different story in the developing world, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the largest points that I have tried to lay out in my articles is the fact that Bitcoin in the developing world, there is, of course, a percentage or a segment of that that is related to speculation. But from what I found talking to traders, the chief use case of Bitcoin in these countries is it is utility use. It's people who use Bitcoin because the traditional financial system or traditional payment rails or the traditional banking system is not serving them. And so that is oftentimes a result of just lack of modernization of current financial infrastructures, but in other times it is a result of explicit financial oppression, where laws are set in place just to restrict the financial freedom of the citizens of these countries. And so they're turning to Bitcoin to get around these laws. Essentially, I mean, to be very frank, they are oftentimes breaking the law of their own country in the pursuit of being their own individual and being in control of their own economic destiny. So,
yeah. And as I read the articles, I see probably two main stories. One is this kind of diaspora story where, let's say, people have left a country and they want to work overseas and they want to send money back home. And then it's about, okay, how do I use Bitcoin to achieve that? And then the other story is sort of like the using, let's say, gift cards and vouchers sort of story. So would you say that's kind of like a good summary then of at least some of the stories that you have been researching?
Yeah, so I would say the gift cards are possibly also a part of the remittance story. That is, gift cards can be used for remittance. But it's a combination of, I would say the two primary use cases happening in these developing countries is, number one, using Bitcoin to transfer value into a country. And that is where people, this diaspora, these migrants who have, for example, left Venezuela, because the traditional system is not serving their needs, they are using Bitcoin to transfer value into Venezuela, and then their families are selling those Bitcoins for actual local currency there. And the second use case that I see is capital flight, and that is moving value out of a country or beyond the reach of the local government. And these things are happening. There are many different flavors of moving value into a country and moving value out of the country, many different reasons for that, but those are the two primary threads that I've noticed.
Yeah. Okay. So look, let me just for the audio listeners, I'm just going to put up on screen share right now. So if you go to usefultulips.org, which is Matt's website, you can see some of the different articles. So I think it might be interesting as well, just to kind of talk through how you figured out that it sort of it ebbs and flows with what's going on in Venezuela. So can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of it, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. So the recent article I wrote on the situation in Venezuela, I looked at these very wide sweeping blackouts, which occurred in March of 2019. They also had another massive blackout in late July. The one I focused on was in March because I felt like it caught the country most by surprise, and it would, the event in March exposed activity to the greatest degree. So essentially what happened is almost the entire country of Venezuela lost power for several days at a time. They have a single hydroelectric dam which feeds the majority of the country's power, and there was a malfunction related to that dam, and it caused a nationwide blackout. During that time, I was looking at local Bitcoin's data, and I noticed that, of course, you would see a drop in transactions during that time. Yeah, if we are guiding the viewers to the article here, I would say if you scroll down to the one more, yeah. So that final one there, yeah, so go up one chart, I'm sorry. So right here, I'll explain this chart here. So the y-axis is the number of transactions per hour. The red hashed line represents the number of local Bitcoin's transactions that occur in Venezuelan bolivars in a given hour during a normal week. So the red hash line, it shows peaks during midday when business is strongest, and then valleys during the nighttime. And you can see on the right of the chart on Saturday and Sunday, the average number of hourly transactions drops, and that makes sense because that's businesses are closed, people are going to church, etc. The blue line shows so the red line represents the average. It was, I believe, the 16-week average of previous transactions, and the blue line represents the number of transactions that actually happened during that week. And the yellow line represents the power outage. And I got this data layer from a website which shows there's a organization called netblocks.org. It actively tracks internet connectivity and freedom in various countries around the world. And so they were monitoring the situation in Venezuela. And you can see that the yellow line is quite high, with about 500,000 active connections during the week. And then all of a sudden it drops down to almost zero. And that is the moment that the blackout started. You can also see at the same exact time the number of transactions on local Bitcoins drops. On Friday, there were about 10% of the transactions that there normally were. On Saturday, vastly lower as well. And this all makes sense because when the power is out, of course, you're going to see a drop in transactions. What I found out was that I looked at these other Latin American currencies during that time, and they also had big drop-offs in number of hourly transactions during the time of the blackout in Venezuela. So yeah, if you scroll down, you can see all the other currencies. So this is the Colombian peso. You can see the Friday and Saturday are well below number of transactions that they would normally have. And this took place in all of these Latin American currencies, as well as the US dollar transactions. And so on a very broad level, what this meant is that these other countries were related to the situation in Venezuela somehow. But more specifically, what I learned in doing the interviews and with the actual traders on this platform is that these drops in transactions were related to remittance, which was taking place from these other countries. They are full of Venezuelan diaspora. About 10% of the country has fled to these other places over the last 5 years-ish. And so what they're doing is they're fleeing to these countries. They're earning currency in these other new countries. They are then taking their new country currency. They're going to local Bitcoins where they find an advertisement where somebody in their new country is willing to purchase or is willing to sell Bitcoin that they already have for the new country currency that person has obtained. So Colombian pesos, for example, if I were a Venezuelan working in Colombia, I would earn an amount of pesos. I would go to local Bitcoins. I would find somebody in Colombia selling Bitcoin and who wanted my pesos. I would do that transaction. So then I give them my pesos. I acquire Bitcoin. At that point, I would have Bitcoin in my local Bitcoins wallet. But that's not the end goal of the remittance process. So the second thing I would do is I would go and I would sell that Bitcoin for Venezuelan bolivars. So I would enter into a second trade where I found somebody inside of Venezuela who did have Venezuelan bolivars in their bank account, and they were willing to send bolivars in their bank account to my family member's Venezuelan bank account as long as I gave them Bitcoin. And so when I did the second transaction, that essentially completes the remittance process. And so that is the reason why during the blackout you saw these dip in transactions across all Latin American currencies. It's because that remittance flow that is normally there is now gone. And so that's the conclusion that I came to.
Awesome. And so it's also interesting that you kind of need this middleman layer, because in order to do that, you need the traders who are there operating as that sort of go-between, because the average worker is not necessarily going to have the time to go do all the trading themselves. So they would go to a middleman trader who's helping them get it to the other side. And also, well, I guess, first of all, in some of your interviews with these individuals, I presume you were figuring out from them, okay, this is the story, this is how you do it. Were any of them reluctant to give up that information? Was that considered like competitive market information that they didn't want to give you? Or was that seen as like, well, anyone can compete in this market?
No, it was definitely, in some cases, they do protect that information. They first of all, what they're doing, depending on their level of connectivity to Venezuela, their activity could get them into trouble. They are perpetuating or executing informal money transmission, and that is, against the law. So they're a little reluctant from that standpoint. But yes, in addition, they're also reluctant to tell you about everything about their business, because that's how they make their money. These people, for the most part, like you said, it is a specialized job to kind of trade on local Bitcoins, and normal people, generally speaking, normal people are not the ones executing the trades. It does go through middlemen on local Bitcoins. So yeah, that is their livelihood. And from what I heard, you can, by Venezuelan standards, you can make a very decent living if you are an informal money transmitter on these platforms.
Yep. And another thing that I find very interesting is it's cheaper for somebody to cross two foreign currency spreads than to use the traditional payment rails of, say, Western Union and PayPal and so on. Now, in some cases, it may be because of bureaucracy and regulation, and in others, it may just be due to fees.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are all kind of one and the same. I think part of it is the monopolistic effect that a lot of these remittance companies have. It's also the fact that traditionally they didn't really have any other option. If you wanted to move money back to your home country, you had to deal with these companies, and even these companies, if they are brick and mortar establishments inside of the country you're sending money to, they have to abide by the laws of the local country that they're in. Otherwise, they'll be sent out of business. And so they have to honor whatever exchange rate Venezuela says is the official rate. And oftentimes the Venezuelan government tries to say that their currency is stronger than it actually is, because it helps them in various other matters of trade. And so, yes, the end result is that Bitcoin remittance is more efficient, and it saves you more money than traditional methods. And that is something that is dynamic. It changes all the time. I think with Venezuela, it's been consistently the best method by far for several years now. But in many other countries that I see this happening, it tends to be a function of what the price that Bitcoin trades at in these various economies. And that can change on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. So, yeah.
I also find it really interesting that, as you mentioned, it's sort of dynamic based on whether the government is more restrictive or less restrictive at that time. And essentially, governments can increase or decrease their level of capital controls, their level of currency controls, their fix of what the currency is pegged at, or any of these different factors. And then the traders on the ground have to react to that, right? Because they have to adapt to that, because maybe it's not that Bitcoin is more efficient in all times at all places. Obviously, there will be times where maybe it makes more sense for them to use the traditional fiat payment rails, correct?
Absolutely. And not only that, but they also use bank accounts in different countries to move money, and Hawala networks and things of that nature. So there are many different tools in their tool chest. And as I explained, it is a dynamic situation where they do evaluate on a day-to-day basis, what is the best way that I can move money across the border. Yep.
Right. So I guess if I were to try and characterize it, then if you are playing the role of one of these traders, it's almost like you need to have access to a range of different options. And then on the day, basically, sort of be clever and pick out which one is most efficient or cheapest based on the conditions at the time, rather than just being a one-track mind of, I only do Bitcoin trading, right?
That's exactly right. And that's why it's a skill. And that's why it's also, it also falls to people who generally do have bank accounts in several different jurisdictions. So that kind of limits this role to somebody who maybe is a little bit more well-traveled, or they have family already existing outside of the country. They can leverage those outside accounts. you can't just be a poor person in Venezuela with very little outside connection and teach yourself to do this. You kind of have to have those privileges already in place in a lot of cases, from what I've found.
Yeah. And is there any particular, let's say, typical profile? Are these people who are, let's say, students and they do it on the side of their study, or maybe they work part-time and then they do Bitcoin trading and this kind of foreign money moving around aspect on the side of their main job? Is that like a typical profile for them?
I've seen the student case several times. I saw it in Zimbabwe, where it was a person of Zimbabwe, and they were studying in South Africa, and that gave them the ability to have these multiple accounts. And there is a lot of remittance that goes from South Africa to Zimbabwe. And so, yes, I think a lot of the times, in the case of Venezuela, these traders oftentimes are, they were unemployed and desperate at some point because of their economic situation, and they kind of learned the ropes of this informal trade just kind of on the fly over the years, and it developed into a full-time job, I believe, as well. So yes, I think that now it is local Bitcoins is, generally speaking, like the majority would be full-time professional trader types. But yes, they probably do start on a part-time basis at the beginning. Maybe they start doing it because they themselves need to do it. They want to send money home, and they found this cool way to do it, and now they're like the nexus for their whole community and wherever they live. So yeah, that's basically how it evolves and works. Yep.
That's really fascinating stuff. And so I'm also curious, with some of these platforms, generally the platforms, say local Bitcoins or Paxful, will want people to keep their trades on the platform. But I've heard colloquially a practice is that people try to, once they've established a relationship with somebody, they try to take that relationship off the platform because they might want to do it without paying the fee to that platform. But then on the other hand, there is also the reputation aspect and the market making aspect of these online platforms. What's been your experience in your discussions and just from your research?
Yeah, so that scenario does play out all the time. I've met people who they were basically, you could say, local Bitcoin's kingpins at one point, where they controlled like a big chunk of the entire liquidity in a given country, and this was years ago. And then when I'm thinking of a particular trader I met in Mexico, where he was responsible for maybe the majority of the volume for Mexican pesos on local Bitcoins for a couple of years, and over time he completely transitioned off of local Bitcoins, and he has his clientele of people who move money and is known in the community as a money exchanger, and so he's not even on local Bitcoins anymore. I think on these platforms there is a fee of trading, so there is an incentive to leave the platform right then and there. In addition to that, you increase your privacy if you leave the platform. But I still think a lot of these traders like to be on the platforms because of the nice advertisement for them, and they'll do trade on or off the platform. And it just depends on the preference of the clientele that's coming to them. And usually the way it happens is the client will do the first trade or two or three on the exchange, and then once they've formed a relationship, they will move off to like a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group or something like that. These traders live off of their reputation, so they're known by people, and these social fabric of these communities, it's always like, can you vouch for me? Oh yes, I can vouch for this guy because my cousin knows him personally, or something like that. It always works out with some sort of personal relationship where you can kind of trust that connection.
That's fascinating. And I think it might be an interesting hypothesis then that really what you see on local Bitcoins or Paxful is actually, it could be underplaying the actual amount of volume going through because people are taking their trade volume off the platform.
For sure. Yeah, that's absolutely. I think these volumes on these exchanges, even though they are trading billions of dollars a year, I still think it's probably a slice of the total peer-to-peer trading that's taking place. And the bigger the trade gets, the more likely it is to go off exchange as well. So the big time trades, the average trade size on local Bitcoins in many of these economies is anywhere between $20 and $80. Sometimes it's a couple of $100. But from what I've heard about people who run their admins of these WhatsApp groups, they say it's like fairly common for 10 Bitcoin trades to take place or to be advertised on these WhatsApp groups, where somebody will come in and say, hey, I need to offload 10 Bitcoins. Who can meet me? So yeah, I think it's a sliver or a slice of what's actually taking place.
Right. And I've also seen some different dynamics around things like, well, let's call them gray markets or whatever, but people who are doing, say, those essay writing things in, say, Kenya, where, let's say, students in the Western world, whether they're in the UK or Australia or America, and they want somebody else to write their essay for them. And then there are all these students in Kenya who want money, and PayPal will not allow that kind of payment through the platform. And so people are moving into using Bitcoin to do that kind of example. So that's another sort of interesting story as well. I presume you would have come across that in your research also.
Yeah. And this spectrum of moral questioning or, moral gray area, it is a huge spectrum. And some of these use cases I can kind of understand and maybe get behind in a certain sense. And then other use cases are like pretty unquestionably immoral. And those are also being executed on these platforms as well. So, things like stealing somebody's credit card information, and then you buy gift cards with that credit card, and then you sell those gift cards immediately for Bitcoin. That is very broadly an immoral thing that should be punished and not be able to, and those things happen on these exchanges. And things like scams where cybercrime where people trick other people to send money, or they think they're getting a good or service or product or things like that. This happened to my sister's company a couple weeks ago, where they were right in the middle of the COVID epidemic, and one of her coworkers got like this random text message, and it was supposedly from the boss, and the boss requested that the coworker immediately go to Target and buy some gift cards for clients. And what ended up happening is she bought $2,000 worth of gift cards. She thought she was giving the codes away to her boss. And it all happened so fast that she didn't realize it was a big scam, and the scammers made off with $2,000. So that type of stuff is obviously undesirable. And, you have to admit that type of stuff is also happening. It's not all good.
Sure. And I think we've got to be honest about these things, right? Like, yeah, that people can use it for bad things. I think it's one of those things where people can overplay it or underplay it, right? So some people might overplay the factor and say, oh, look, everyone in the developing world is using Bitcoin. And that's not quite true, right? Like, it's really more like in these certain circumstances, it makes sense for people to use Bitcoin. And in others, maybe it doesn't make sense for them, right? And I think this also ties into how it's easy to criticize some of the legacy financial institutions, but really the reason for those high fees or delays is because they're facing a lot of regulatory burden, or that's probably the main one. But they also face fraud and chargebacks and so on. And so they're building in the cost for dealing with the fraud and the chargebacks and all these other things into their cost. And that's why if you look at some of the legacy financial institutions, they have quite high fees relative to just the straight Bitcoin transaction cost. But that's not the only transaction cost, right?
Absolutely.
Broadly considered.
That's a huge factor at play. And it's interesting. I got to know an older gentleman who's, done his time on Wall Street, and he really understands Wall Street to a large degree. And behind every single like arcane law that is out of place in today's world. Those laws came about because the system broke at a certain time where, you know, the system collapsed, or some scammer type Wall Street person got away with something, and so they put this law into place, and now there's just millions of laws on top of each other. But generally speaking, they were put into place for the right reasons, but now it's just they do tend to cause a lot of bureaucratic friction, and so there should be a happy medium between, making way for these new financial technologies, but also trying to make sure that the payment system is robust and has guarantees and protects people.
Right. Also, the question around stablecoins. So, hypothetically, somebody could say, "Hey, why don't they just use Tether? Why don't they just use one of these other GUSD or whatever stablecoin?" Is it a question of education, or is it a question of access, or is it just like a mindshare thing? People don't know about it.
I think it's a little bit of everything. I think it is true that in a lot of these markets, Bitcoin already has the liquidity, the order book depth, and people already are familiar with Bitcoin. So if you're using Bitcoin, there's really not a need to use Tether, because even in the case that they're not holding on to the Bitcoin, for example, if I were doing capital flight out of Venezuela, I was converting my bolivars into US dollars. People are already doing that on local Bitcoins, where they trade away their bolivars for Bitcoin, and then they sell their Bitcoin for PayPal dollars, or they sell their Bitcoin for Zelle dollars. And there's a million different online wallets that they can hold dollars in. And those are essentially de facto stablecoins as well. So is Tether bringing something to the table that is better than the current system that is in place? I'm not saying it is or isn't. I think there's a lot of great things about the way that you can build smart contracts around stablecoins, and the way where you can reduce custodial risk, reduce counterparty risk in some cases with stablecoins. Those are definitely compelling features. So I think, so it's a partially mind share, partially, I always say that in order for a new technology to start gaining network effects, or in order for a new technology to overcome the incumbent network effects of the incumbent system, it has to be a paradigm shift better. And is Tether a paradigm shift better than the way that people are already acquiring US dollars? I'm not sure it is or isn't. That's something that's playing out right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the other factor is obviously number go up. Right now, you and I in the Western world, right, in Australia, US, UK, Canada, etc., many of us buy Bitcoin and we believe it is going up in value, and that's why we want to hold it. Now, that may not necessarily be true in the developing world where, let's say, you're living more hand to mouth. You don't have the potential to save in Bitcoin. To what extent were you seeing maybe some of these traders, once they start interacting with Bitcoin, they actually want to start hodling Bitcoin too? Did you see that as well?
Oh, yeah. And I would say I can't think of a single case where that didn't happen, where once somebody became familiar with the technology, they were enamored by the cool factor of it and the niftiness of it, and the way that, it enabled them to do things that they were not able to do before. And these people in highly restrictive economic environments, they understand the value proposition of Bitcoin better than anyone in the world, because they were born into these broken, dysfunctional monetary systems, and so they understand the value of permissionlessness, and the value of fiscal discipline and monetary discipline and things of that nature. They understand you don't have to explain that to them at all. So yeah, in fact, I would say that in many cases, when I talk to these traders, they really have nothing to gain by talking to me, by revealing this information. The only thing, I think, in many of the cases that they do talk to me, the only reason they talk to me is because they have this shared love of this cool Bitcoin thing, and they want to share their story with the world. They want to say, like, wow, I could tell my story to this guy who's going to write an article, and he could tell the world about these cool things that I'm doing with Bitcoin. So,
right. And I guess the other question I have is, obviously those people who are directly interacting with Bitcoin regularly, they see the value and they want to hold Bitcoin eventually, right? Now, obviously it might be more difficult for them if you're not earning as much, you can't save as much, obviously. But is it also that their counterparties are also getting into the idea of hodling as well, like not just using it as a payment rail?
yeah, I think so. I don't have a direct story about that, but I'm sure it is happening because it seems to happen with, most everybody who comes into contact with Bitcoin. There is a novelty about it. There's something interesting about it. I will also say, though, that there's a big chunk of people who, in these countries, who they got burned by Bitcoin once before, where they thought it was going to go to the moon, and then it crashed, or they bought Bitcoin and then they threw it into a Ponzi scheme and they got burned that way. Or even if it didn't directly happen to them, everybody knows somebody who lost money on some sort of scam or, something like that. So that definitely turns away a lot of people.
Yeah. The other question I had was around Lightning use. So obviously Lightning is very early, and I have seen some stories where individuals are using it. So there is that Satoshi Beach, I forgot the exact name, but essentially there was a group where entire towns were just using wallet of Satoshi, a custodial Lightning wallet. Have you seen anything like that, or is it mostly on-chain usage?
Yeah, so I know I haven't heard of that specific case. Usually when I hear a story about an entire town, transacting in Bitcoin, like, I'm a little bit skeptical. But that's not to say that maybe it hasn't happened to a certain degree in a couple of little towns. Um, However, aside from that, I have seen a couple companies, and in fact, I've been talking very closely with a particular company recently who does use Lightning, and they serve developing country users with Lightning infrastructure. And it is, I think it addresses a lot of the weaknesses of Bitcoin in that you can instantly transfer, and that's a huge deal. And the fees are incredibly low, and that's an even bigger deal because on-chain transfers are very expensive for people in developing countries who, like I said, they're moving sometimes $5-6 worth of money. They don't have the money to pay, 50 cents for a blockchain fee. So I think Lightning is potentially a perfect fit for a lot of these use cases, and yeah. So I'm hopeful that it will develop into something more and soon. Yeah, I'm trying to honestly work on something myself right now that kind of involves that. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things where potentially older phones may not be able to use some of the newer Lightning wallets. But I think a good example might be something like Phoenix for Android, where it is a non-custodial wallet, but the experience is almost like a custodial wallet. Or another one might be Wallet of Satoshi or Blue Wallet, or Breeze Wallet is another one as well. So I guess these are examples, but again, it takes time for people to get familiar with it and start to really build up their usage of it.
Yeah, and the smart companies, they are building their apps to be backwards compatible with these older versions because they know that that's a part of the territory that they're working in. I've seen several, Silicon Valley type companies where they build a shiny new app that's only working on the last 3 versions of Android or whatever. But the smart companies are already taking that into consideration, and their apps are running on 2012 Android software. So.
Yeah, that's good to see. Another area I was keen to talk about is KYC versus non-KYC. So I know that local Bitcoins and Paxful do have KYC, but there are other platforms that don't necessarily use KYC. So things like Bisq or Hodl Hodl, let's say, although maybe the volume on those in these countries is not as high. What's been your experience on the KYC question?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when these KYC exchanges, it's interesting to see that they generally are also more decentralized and they have less custodian, and there's a reason for that. And it's because they wouldn't get away with not doing KYC unless they were decentralized. If they had a centralized company somewhere and they were not doing KYC, they would be in jail. And so the drawback of a lot of these non-KYC exchanges is that they have to make the architecture of these applications such that they are non-custodial. They're, generally speaking, mostly on-chain transfers like BISC. And so that it's very hard to make a user-friendly experience around all of these technical features that you have to maintain decentralization. So it is very tough to do. And what I've seen with BISC, and I like the BISC team, and I think they're doing great work. But BISC, in my opinion, it's kind of like it's a P2P exchange designed for like a nuclear winter, but we're not in a nuclear winter right now. We're just kind of in like this very mildly restrictive environment where people can still use custodial wallets and get away with it. Like, for example, as long as if you're using a custodial wallet where your money is custodied in another country that's not your own country, that's just fine for a lot of people. When Venezuelans hold their money in PayPal, they have no problem with it because the US government doesn't have any problem with what they're doing. It's the Venezuelan government that they care about. So yeah, and in terms of I think KYC AML is going to continue to increase, and not only on the front end where you have to ask this of users before they even do their first trade, which it's possible that we could head in that direction, which would be awful. But they have to do things on the back end to meet these regulatory agencies' requirements. They have to set up all this infrastructure to communicate with the banking system about the identity of the traders on their platform and all that other crazy stuff. So I think that's probably only going to strengthen because the banks will love to make the Bitcoin experience more inefficient. And so, yeah, I personally feel like this will be another beautiful test of Bitcoin. Is it truly decentralized enough to avoid a lot of these issues? We're going to find out.
Right. And I think it's also fair to point out, and I think Ray Youssef, the CEO of Paxful, has spoken about KYC, and I think his view is something like it helps essentially Paxful obviously not get shut down, and ultimately that enables the company Paxful to serve many more people. And so we have to consider that as well when we're thinking about, okay, KYC and non-KYC and so on. I think it's one of, yeah.
And going into calling back to what we were talking about before about like some seriously nefarious use cases, there's no doubt that KYC AML reduces that stuff as well. And so that is a good thing. Obviously I understand that there's a lot of problems with all this red tape just to make a transaction. But, that's why it does have to be a balance. And Ray and also local Bitcoins, both Paxful and local Bitcoins have said that adding in this stuff has cleaned up the activity on their platform and made it a safer environment for the good users, on the platform. So I'm not trying to shill for the regulatory agencies whatsoever, but there's a trade-off to everything. So
yeah. Also, another really fascinating thing is this concept of all-time high denominated in a foreign currency. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the way that Paxful and local Bitcoins release their data, they, as of right now, they don't release country level data. Like, honestly, a lot of the time, I don't know what country their unverified users are in. They have IP checks and things of that nature, but that can only go so far. So the data we do have is what currency was being used in a given trade. And so, yeah, right now in peer-to-peer markets, there are specific regions, West Africa, East Africa, India, Latin America last year, and they've had a strong bump up this year as well. But in these developing markets, in these places with known monetary restrictions, you're seeing all-time highs. And it's a great validation of the idea of Bitcoin, in that Bitcoin is an extremely attractive use case, or I should say an increasingly attractive use case in these places that have a high amount of restriction.
Right. And as I understand, the typical story that we have seen with all-time high in a foreign currency is usually it's an indicator that that government is trying to forcefully set the price of their money lower. So what we're seeing is kind of like the black market real price for that money is going like even lower, so to speak. So then in Bitcoin, you can sort of see what the real price is, sort of like the street price, though. It's not necessarily the real price, but there's kind of a difference there.
That's a good way to put it. And yes, it is true. And I have this measurement on my website where I actually track the percentage. I track how much Bitcoin trades at against various currencies. And it is reflective of an unofficial exchange rate, or a black market exchange rate, or a street exchange rate, whatever you want to call it. It is reflective of that. And so when you see this street exchange rate start diverging from the official exchange rate, it is an indicator that potentially things are falling apart in that country, or that they are laying on new restrictions or things of that nature. So yes, it's really cool to have the data and to see it play out like that. And in my Argentina article, I even lined up volume spikes with particular events related to imposition of new capital controls or economic events and things of that nature. You can actually see Bitcoin volume spike when certain things happen in the real world. And it's really a compelling argument about the proposition of Bitcoin.
Right. And I think it's one of those things where the more governments try to clamp down, the more people will just learn about Bitcoin. And then typically once people get into Bitcoin and they're holding Bitcoin and then they've profited from it, they don't really want to leave, right?
Yeah, definitely. And, the technical literacy of people all around the world is only increasing, and their access to the internet is only increasing. So this is something that is not going to go away. And in fact, it's only going to get worse from the perspective of these governments. I like to say that, these governments, they build walled gardens in their country, monetarily speaking. They make all these rules about what people can and can't do with money in their country. And Bitcoin and the internet are just like poking holes in these walls and, allowing people to just completely disregard this type of stuff. So
that's really cool. And Matt, I know you're doing a little bit of work with Paxful and the Open Money Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Paxful, I've been bugging them for a couple of years. I think I showed up to their office. I showed up to their office a few years ago. They had no idea who I was, and I said, "Hey, I'm looking at your data, and tell me all about what you guys are doing and all that stuff." But over time, they kind of warmed up to me, and so they've read my articles, and they find not only interesting statements about I'm kind of good marketing for Bitcoin, as it were, but I'm also finding interesting like business intelligence for them as a company, where I can, they told me that, wow, we had no idea that Latin America was such a booming market, or that Venezuela was the crux of Latin American volume until we read your article. So they're giving me a sponsorship to write these articles, and I'm also kind of helping them because I'm on the ground with the users. I help them understand the use cases more, and such that they can build products that make these use cases and user experiences a lot easier. With Open Money Initiative, I'm not officially a part of the Open Money Initiative. I know Alejandro Machado there pretty well. I've had many conversations with him, and we always trade intel on the market in Venezuela. And so I just I did an article under their handle because I think they do good work, and yeah, I wanted them to have exposure, and also for me to get exposure from their current standing. So, yep.
Awesome. Also, I'll just check now if anyone in the chat has any questions for Matt. And I suppose just while we're waiting, Matt, do you have any tips for people who want to do their own data analysis?
Oh man, yeah, I would say start. When I learn computer science, I'm not good in the classroom where they're teaching you these abstract concepts. And when I was in college, I think my semester project was building a fake bank account, and so when I learn, I like to have real problems that I'm working on. So find a data set that you're really interested in, and start and think of a solution, or think of some sort of goal. And the internet is like, everyone complains about the cost of education nowadays, but knowledge is free. So you can go on the internet, on YouTube, and you can watch every video known to mankind about learning how to do data analysis. And so you can truly teach yourself. I would also recommend the boot camps for people who are not like perfectly motivated, and I'm not one of those people. When you go to a boot camp, you get a rigorous schedule where they kind of put you in a competitive environment, and they force you to study 10, 12, 15 hours a day, and you learn really fast that way too. So, yep.
Great. And any tips in terms of pitfalls when assessing Bitcoin data and Bitcoin volume? Are there any tips on that side for listeners who want to do their own Bitcoin analysis?
I don't know. There's millions of pitfalls you can make. You just have to really have the domain knowledge of the space, and you have to know, you have to be open to the idea that your original answer is totally wrong. And that happens to me routinely, where I think something's happening in this way, and then I talk to somebody and they explain it to me in a way where it was the complete opposite. So I guess just be open to that possibility, and yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, look, I think that's just about it. So I'll just put up on the screen right now, just for anyone who's viewing, go to usefultulips.org. Matt, is there anywhere else you'd like people to find you online?
Yeah. So if you go to the website, you can see my Medium articles are embedded in the center. And then on the right, you can see my Twitter handle. So you can follow me on Twitter. I regularly make tweets there as well. And then on the left-hand side is where you can actually go in and look at volume charts in different parts of the world. So, yeah, for example, you can see that I have a heat map of, if the volumes are increasing or decreasing in certain regions. And then when you scroll down, you can actually drill down on particular regions and even particular countries and currencies. So it's all really cool stuff. If you're like an economics student, this is, I believe, a treasure trove of interesting stuff. So,
yeah. Actually, just one last question while we're here on this. One thing that I find interesting when I was looking through this data earlier as well is most people are used to thinking, oh, Bitcoin, didn't that thing die back in 2017? But funnily enough, we're actually seeing more volume now in certain continents than we did back in 2017. So Latin America and Africa actually have much more volume, and you can see that on usefultulips.org on the combined world page.
Yeah, exactly. And so it kind of tells you that there might be something to Bitcoin outside of speculation. People might be using it for reasons besides speculation, and that's kind of the argument that I try to make.
Fantastic. All right. Well, look, I think that's pretty much it for this one. So thank you again for joining me, Matt.
Thank you, Stephan.
Thanks. And just for listeners, you can subscribe at stephanlivera.com, and there'll be show notes there. You can get all the links, and I will get a transcript for this up in a couple of days. So that's it from us. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you in the Citadels.